Okay, well, it's really great to be here today. And I'm going to talk about getting an echo somewhere, talk about animal handling, simple ways to improve animal handling. And maybe we could go to the next slide, please. One of the things to look for is shadows. We have a lot of facilities in slaughterhouses that are partly outside. And this is an example of sharp shadows. In fact, my student Dennis Wilson just finished up a paper and it's published in Meat Science, an observational study. And he documented that a sharp shadow, like you see there, the animals will be more likely to stop compared to a soft shadow, blurry shadow, or no shadow at all. And it's important to be aware of these things because it can sometimes change with the time of day. We can go to the next slide, please. Now here's an example of reflections on a stainless steel stun box. And this can cause animals to stop, refuse to enter. Another problem you could have in this stun box is the animals can see through it and get a view of the equipment and the people out on the slaughter floor. That's also going to make animals stop. Now, one good feature in this stun box is it has a very good non-slip floor. Sometimes cattle their foot will slip like this and they get really agitated. And putting in a non-slip floor can make a big difference. Now, there are many stun boxes that have a diamond plate embossed metal floor. Those are too slippery. You need to cover them up with rubber mats or some other thing that will give that animal a non-slip floor. Now, sometimes you can change this by moving the lights on the ceiling. You move the lights and make the reflection go away. Let's go to the next slide. Now, I want to teach you to be a better observer. These are some weird shadows that eclipses make through the trees. I noticed this on the sidewalk on our college campus. Other people didn't. I want to make you a better observer. Look at exactly where the animals stop in your facility or the animals turn back. Now, both in the auditing system that we use from our North American Meat Institute and Animal Welfare Quality, some of the things that are measured are stopping, turning back, and electric prod or electric goad use. And if you fix some of these problems with the lighting or the flooring, then the electric goad will not be needed as often. Let's go to the next slide. And here's an example of an animal seeing its own shadow. And those are very, very sharp shadows. Now you'll see the English word there, balking. That's an industry term in the US for stopping, the animal stopping and refusing to move forward. Now, this is going from an outdoor lairage into a dark building. And on a cloudy day, you wouldn't have a problem with this. But what I wanted to get you looking, what exactly is the animal looking at? Let's go to the next slide. Now, cattle and pigs have wide angle vision, and you've got a little blind spot right behind them. They have poor depth perception. This is the reason why if the animal sees a drain, it's going to stop and put its head down. Well, let it put its head down. Then when the head comes back up, then you can push them forward. But don't try to push them when they have the head down looking at a change in the floor. That's likely to make them turn back on you. Let's go to the next slide. That shows just a really nice concrete curved race. Another basic principle with all animals is a calm animal is easier to handle. And if the animals get really fearful and agitated, it takes 20 to 30 minutes for them to calm back down. So if you keep them calm, it's very important for people to not yell and scream at animals. Yelling and screaming, making a lot of noise, that gets animals scared, fearful. Let's go to the next slide. Now, what are some of the signs that cattle are fearful? You'll see eye white. They'll vocalize during handling. If you have many cattle vocalizing in the stun box, you may be hurting them with the head holder. The head holder is too tight. If they go, when you put the head holder on, it's too tight. Do not leave them in the head holder. When you put them in the head holder, use the captive bolt stunner. Don't wait. And when animals are manuring, making manure, that is another sign of stress because they've gotten scared and so they make a manure. Tail switching. Another score that you can do is vocalization in the stun box, and you score each animal. Did it moo? In the stun box? Yes or no? And if you have high percentages of cattle vocalizing in the stun box, you have something wrong that you need to fix. Let's go to the next slide. Here's just a list of things that can make them stop. Reflections on metal or water, seeing people up ahead, moving objects, air blowing back in their faces. You can have different time of day effects when different fans are turned on inside the factory. And if you have air blowing back in their faces, they will not move. Another thing that Dennis Wilson found in his study is that sometimes there's a big noisy truck that was parked alongside the lairage. And when that was there with a lot of noise, the cattle were more difficult to move, more stopping, more turning back, and more forceful methods to use to move them, such as tail twisting. This is just kind of a checklist of things that you can work on because many small changes can make a big difference. We'll go to the next slide. And here's just some more things that can make animals refuse to move. You can see some reflections on some water. This place does have a good non-slip floor. Any place where floor changes, maybe going from a concrete floor to a metal floor, they're going to tend to stop. Maybe objects lying on the ground, coats on fences. You know, somebody takes a coat and hangs it over the fence. That can make the animals stop. Lots of little things that you need to be observant because you fix a whole lot of little things like the distractions, improve the flooring, improve the lighting. That can really improve the animal handling. Let's go to the next slide. Now here's an abattoir where air was blowing out in the animal's face. And we corrected that. And when we corrected that, the use of the electric goad could be reduced. And the number of cattle that would vocalize moo went to 0. You see, you can also use scoring, the vocalization in pigs and cattle, and electric prod use or electric goad use and falling. Just you can test whether a change in your procedure or your facility made a difference. Because I want the vocalization score to go down, the electric goad score to go down. And here's before and after. So collect some before and after data after you make a change. Let's go to the next slide. You need to get down in the race and look at what the animals are seeing. Pigs, you're going to have to get way down. Cattle, just bend over and walk through the race. Let's go to the next slide. Well, what do you see in that photo? Well, there's a white paper cup on the floor. There's a little tiny piece of red string. Sometimes things that small will make them stop. Let's go to the next slide. This pig is stopping and he's looking at the reflections of off of dripping water out of the top of the race. And I eliminated the dripping water and the handling improved. I often get asked, do they know they're going to get slaughtered? I've actually studied some of the stress levels, cortisol levels in cattle, and the cortisol levels range from high to low, but they're the same as handling on the farm for vaccinations. They're the same range of cortisol levels compared to farm handling. You know, you hold them on the head holder on the farm. Let's go to the next slide. This is another example of some light streaks. We got sharp shadows there, cause your animals to stop. Let's go to the next slide. Here are pigs stopping where the floor is changing from concrete to steel. And they've put their heads down and they're looking right at the white plastic strip. Now, I would probably remove that white plastic strip and replace it with a gray strip that matched the color of the concrete. And then you'd have less of a change. That'd be a simple change that may help. And we can go to the next slide. Here's an example of more shadows on a loading ramp, and you can actually see the person's shadow. I've seen situations where the person's shadow moving was making animals stop. This facility needs to have a solid side put on it to prevent the animals from seeing vehicles and other distractions outside the facility. We can go to the next slide. Now that big gate there has a soft rubber conveyor curtain on the bottom part of the gate. And if you close that on the pigs, it won't hurt them. And the pigs don't try to go through it. All that's holding the sheep in the sheep shearing picture, is a cloth curtain. That's all that's holding them in. That's using behavior. I want you to use behavior, not force. And we can go to the next slide. Here's another example of a gate for pigs, and the whole gate is just a rubber curtain. So if you were to close it on the pigs, it doesn't hurt them. Now they think it's a solid wall, and they don't try to go through it. I really liked this. Also, this slide shows very good non-slip flooring. Let's go to the next slide. Now this animal is stopping because you can see out through the side, and I'll show you how I fixed it. Let's go to the next slide. I just added some solid sides. So I would recommend experimenting with cardboard and just try different things. And if it works, then replace the cardboard with metal. But I do a lot of things with cardboard just to try and experiment with different ways to put up a solid side so that approaching animals don't see people up ahead. And then if I find the piece of cardboard works, then I replace it with a piece of heavy plastic or metal. Go to the next slide. Here's an example of a really bad reflection. The pigs constantly backed up, backed up, backed up. I moved the lights on the ceiling. This reflection then went away, and the pigs walked easily through the race. We can go to the next slide. There's a pig stopping at a metal strip. Also, there's another shadow right there. I want to get you aware of these things. Now, maybe some of the shadows you can't get rid of, but there's other things that you can fix. Let's go to the next slide. Now, here's an example of using a light to light up the stun box entrance. Notice that the light lights up the way in front of the animal. You want the animal to see a lighted place up ahead. They do not like going into the dark. You know, there's research that shows that pigs and cattle both will tend to approach a place that is lighted. We can go to the next slide. Now this just shows before and after. I think it's really important to do measurements. I took a baseline measurement of how many pigs were electric goaded, 38%. It's really bad going into the single file race. I added a light to the race entrance, and the electric goad score went down to 4%. You see, so I can measure progress. That's why I think measuring is so important. You measure vocalization, slips and falls, turning back, electric goad use. You've got measurements in welfare quality, and you've also got measurements system on my web page, Grandin.com. Also in my new book, The Slaughter of Farm Animals, Practical Ways of Enhancing Welfare, available from cabby.org. And there's also guidelines on Grandin.com on how to do measurements, Grandin.com, just my last name. And another very useful website is animalhandling.org. Animalhandling.org. And you do have to use the English word. Let's go to the next slide. Now experiment. I go in and I experiment with a portable light, experiment with cardboard, and experiment with taping it to things. You know, try different things with lights. And then when you find something that works, then make it permanent. Let's go to the next slide. Now this shows a head restrainer, and I've put a barrier up in front of it. So when the animal puts its head in the head restrainer, it's not seeing people out on the processing floor. And I've put an overhead light because they don't like going into the dark. You can go to the next slide. Now here's just an example of heading towards the light right there. And we can go to the next slide. That's an example of sticking their head into the dark. That does not work very well. That's bad. Let's go to the next slide. Here's another example headed towards the light. So I want to just give you some cow's eye views of some of these different restrainers headed towards the light. That's good. Let's go to the next slide. This is going into a box and the sliding door is too low. Some of the cattle today are much taller. And if the animal thinks he's going to hit his back, he's not going to want to go in. So you might want to have that sliding door raise up higher. Let's go to the next slide. There's a back bruise. We've had some problems on trucks with tall cattle hitting their backs. Animals can bruise until after stunning, up until bleeding. After they're bled, they will not bruise, but they can bruise even right after stunning before bleeding. And stun box doors also will cause these kind of bruises. So you need to have good controls where it's easy for the operator to stop the gate from coming down. Let's go to the next slide. That just shows a nice little system in a small meat plant. Let's go to the next slide. Here's an example of dark inside, kind of bright outside. I call that the dark movie theater effect. And this is going to be a bigger problem on sunny days. We can go to the next slide. Electric prods should never be your main driving tool. Do not carry electric goads around. And if you fix your facility, only place you might have to use it would be to enter the stun box. In the whole other parts of the lairage, there should be no electric prods. Let's go to the next slide. Now here are some other driving aids. That's a nice flag that some of our people have made. He also has a handhold in the middle. Really nice little homemade flag and a really good non-slip floor for the pigs. And we'll go to the next slide. And there's just another little flag. I like sometimes little flags. People get way too excited. Don't be doing this with it. Just use it to turn them and guide them. Don't be hitting them, yelling at them. I do have a video called Proper Use of Livestock Driving Tools. And when a cardboard box starts breaking when I hit it, that's definitely abusive feeding. Let's go to the next slide. And it just shows another little tool for turning an animal. And we can go to the next slide. There's another little tool that people have made. We can go to the next slide. And that's for moving pigs out of large lairage pens. And we can go to the next slide. When does tapping become beating? This has become an issue. We've had plants shut down. The inspector said they were beating the pigs. We can go on to the next slide. And I do have a video of proper use of livestock driving tools. You do have to use the English title to find it. Proper use of livestock driving tools. Now, these are things you never do. Never, never, never drag conscious animals. Poke sensitive areas like the rectum or the eyes. deliberately slamming gates on animals, driving animals over the top of animals, and beating animals. You never, never do these things. Let's go to the next slide. If you're using powered gates in a system, never knock animals over with powered gates or drag them with powered gates. Never. In our plants, they'll shut you down if you drag pigs with power gates. In fact, you need to be looking at these more like power steering. It's not automatic handling. Let's go to the next slide. Now we need to understand the animal behavior. Now you might have completely tame animals. I just put a head collar on them and I lead them. But a lot of the animals we have are not completely tame. And they have a flight zone. You know, you approach the animal, it moves away. It has a point of balance at the shoulder. A big mistake I see people make is they stand in front of the head of an animal, try to poke it on the rear end with a paddle. Also, you want to use their natural following behavior. If the animals are moving, following the leader, just leave them alone. Also, animals have a natural behavior to go back to where they come from. That's the reason why some of the curved facilities work. And we can go to the next slide. Now that shows the flight zone of wild sheep. It's almost like a bubble around them. Now, completely tame animals, you won't have this. But people need to understand this kind of bubble effect. And the size of it is determined by the genetics, amount of contact with people, and the quality of contact, gentle and quiet or yelling and bad. Let's go to the next slide. This diagram's a little bit complicated, but the most important thing on this diagram is you've got a line right here at the shoulder. And if you're in a single file race and you want to make it go forward, you need to be behind that line at the shoulder. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, this is just more point of balance principles, and we can go to the next slide. Now this animal is rearing up because the person's too close. That person's in the flight zone. And what that person needs to do is back up and get out of the flight zone. And if an animal rears up in a race or in a stun box, you need to back away, back away. And when you back away and you remove yourself from the flight zone, he will go back down. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is a really good method for getting an animal into a stun box and reduce electric prod use. And what you do is you quickly walk back by the shoulder of the animal. Quickly. You step forward, walk back by them in the opposite direction. And when you cross that line in the shoulder, your animals will go forward. This is a really useful little handling method that can help you greatly reduce electric goad use. Let's go to the next slide. And this just shows it in a bigger, longer raceway, walking back by them. And as you walk back by each animal, it will go forward. Try it. It works. And these diagrams, you have the slideshow. You've got permission to translate this slideshow if you'd like. And especially these diagrams right here to copy them and use them. You can use them off of this slideshow. Let's go to the next slide. Handle small groups. This is especially important for cattle and pigs. And this is true for small plants. It's true for big plants. The same thing. And you'll notice that that handling facility is mostly empty. The mistake people make is jamming everything forward. Now, for a small plant, you might only want to bring up 4 cattle at a time. Good handling is going to require more walking. Pigs, again, small groups. Let's go to the next slide. And here's using a crowding pen correctly. It's half full. You know, the crowding pen area that leads up to the single file, fill it half full. Move small groups. Let's go to the next slide. Well, and then right there, you've got an animal that turned around. Now, here's another tip. Wait until there's space in your single file Then when you bring up your next group, you keep them walking through the crowd area, and they'll just keep walking into the single file. They've turned around because he wants to go back to the lairage, and you brought them up there before there was space in the single file race. Let's go to the next slide. Sheep, you can handle in large groups. Sheep, you can handle in continuous flow. Cattle and pigs, small, separate groups. This is a species difference. Cattle and pigs, small, separate groups. And many of the smaller plants in Europe, for cattle, it might be 4 you bring up at a time. Pigs, it's going to be you're bringing up 4 or 5 at a time, not 15. Not 15. That's too many. Even in our really big plants, that's too many to bring up at a time. Let's go to the next slide. Use the following behavior. If your animals are following and they're moving, leave them alone. Step back, leave them alone. Let's go to the next slide. Non-slip flooring. I can't emphasize enough the importance of non-slip flooring. Now I want to see how good an observer you are. I like to ask people, how many of you saw that animal was looking at the sunbeam? He's looking right at it, and it's going to make him stop. I want you seeing these things, and then you try to eliminate that sunbeam. Let's go to the next slide. Well, there's a non-slip floor just made out of steel rods. It's very important. You always want to put the steel rods like this. Never. This is wrong. Crossing is wrong. Putting them like this is right. That grid must lay flat on the floor. Otherwise, it can catch hooves. This also sometimes is an easy way to fix stun box floors. Let's go to the next slide. And there's a nice new concrete non-slip floor. And we can go to the next slide. And that's a good non-slip floor for shape. And that was made by stamping expanded metal mesh into the wet concrete. Really, really nice floor for sheep and pigs. And you can copy these slides and use them. I also have more pictures on Grandin.com and in my slaughter book. Let's go to the next slide. Now there's too many cattle in the lairage pen. Now you may have smaller lairage pens, but there's too many cattle in there. And if they have to spend the night there, there's no way that they can rest. Let's go to the next slide. Let's get the right amount of cattle. This is especially important if they spend the night. They've got room here to lay down and rest. Also, handling in the last 5 minutes has a big effect on meat quality. Electric goads in the last 5 minutes will make tough meat in cattle, and in pigs, electric goads in the last 5 minutes, pale, soft, watery meat. So reducing stress, right before slaughter is really important. Let's go to the next slide. There's the correct amount of pigs in a lairage pen. Pigs should always have enough room so they can lay down all at the same time without being on top of each other. And that's got the correct amount of pigs in that pen. Let's go to the next slide. And that's a very nice concrete stair-step ramp. But I also want you to notice that animal is avoiding walking on the reflection of light down the middle of that ramp. Let's go to the next slide. All right, I want to show you some things on design of unloading ramps. We'll go to the next slide. This shows the correct spacing between the cleats. Some people have not understood that word. Let's say the bars on the floor. This is the correct spacing. Hoof fits between the bars. We'll go to the next slide. That's too close together. That's bad. The hoof slips over the top of the bars. Let's go to the next slide. and too far apart. This is wrong, and the hoof slips between the bars. So you must get the correct spacing for the bars, and for pigs and sheep, they'll be closer together than for cattle. Let's go to the next slide. Now this shows the correct angle for the crowding pen going into single file raceway for cattle and pigs. This is good. That's laid out correctly. One side straight, the other side on a 30-degree angle. And we'll go to the next slide. That is wrong. That's bad. It's too gradual. The animals will jam in this. And if you've made this mistake, this will have to be changed. It is impossible to handle them if this is laid out wrong like this. Let's go to the next slide. And this is an easy little design for pigs where you have a single little offset step to stop the pigs from jamming at the entrance to the single file race. Let's go to the next slide. Now we need to be looking at things like lameness. I'm seeing more and more problems with the animal coming into the abattoir having problems. Lame pigs, lame cattle, difficulty walking. Difficulty walking. That's what lameness is. You can have a normal animal, you have an animal that has a little bit of a problem walking, and then you have an animal that's almost a non-ambulatory downer. But it's important to score things because I'm seeing more welfare issues now at a slaughterhouse where it's something that has to be fixed at the farm. We're getting problems with fatigued cattle that don't want to move. It's heavier at a younger age. There's genetic issues, leg conformation issues where we're breeding for meat and they have bad feet and legs. And this is a problem that's slowly gotten worse. And I'm going to have to fix it at the farm. Or pigs that are very hard to handle because the producer has never walked through them. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, here's a whole lot of things that can make animals difficult to handle. And pigs differentiate between a person walking through their pen and a person in the alley. And it's very important for the farmer to walk through pens of pigs and get them accustomed to just quietly getting up and moving away. And if pigs have never experienced a person walking through them while they're being grown, they'll be horrible, really difficult to handle at the slaughterhouse. And you need to keep track and measure. There may be pigs coming in from certain farms that are very difficult to handle. And we're going to have to go back to the farm to correct the problem. Let's go to the next slide. There's a really simple little curved layout that will work very nicely for sheep and cattle. And the principle here, they'd like to go back to where they come from. So as they come around the bend, they're going back to where they came from. You're using behavior there. Let's go to the next slide. And that's just another simple little layout using that same principle of going back to where you come from. And the handler actually stands on that little grating at the gate pivot, and the animals will just come around you. Let's go to the next slide. And that's a layout for a very small plant. And we can go on to the next slide. And that's the layout for a little bigger plant with everything inside a building. And we go on to the next slide. And this is just a little restraint device for shape. And we can go on to the next slide. Well, that's an example of a really bad building material. Don't use things like this. You get rats and mice and everything else in that. That's just an example of a type of building material you should never use in a lairage. Let's go to the next slide. There are some of my books. And of course, I've got my new slaughtering book. I didn't get it on the slide. This just came out from Kebby. And I would very much like to answer some questions. Okay, well, thank you for having me. It was wonderful to be here by video.